So hello everybody, I am Mike Mena once again bringing to you another video mini-series in two parts. And I'm going to focus on the first two chapters from the book Translanguaging, Language, Bilingualism, and Education by Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So here I focus on the first two chapters only, as these are the theoretical portions of the book. And these particular chapters, and along with some of other of Ofelia Garcia's work and Li Wei's, I hear has led to a lot of misunderstandings and even a potential misuse of the theory. So, translanguaging is a concept that I am quite a fan of. However, if you were like me, perhaps you really couldn't tell the difference between translanguaging and code switching and bilingualism and multilingualism. So all these words, right? And translanguaging also claims that it's going to go beyond all of these terms, right? So we have beyond language, beyond disciplinary boundaries, beyond multi-competence. So a lot of beyonding going on here. What's kind of confusing also is that this book is written so well, and you can tell that these authors are educators. This book is written so well that the radicalness of their translanguaging theory is almost lost in the easiness of the read, which is kind of a ironic problem to have. Now, from what I can tell, when I hear people talking about this stuff, about this translanguaging stuff, there is a problem with the concept language. Or actually, what does it mean to speak of a language? A language. Particularly the way people want to split up our huge linguistic repertoires into objects that we give names to. For example, English or Spanish or Chinese or Japanese. Now, this happens on so many levels that I think could prevent a lot of people from really understanding this book, kind of like me the first time that I read it. So let's talk about the way concepts become objects. So concepts becoming objects, objectifying concepts, especially through very common everyday ways of speaking. For example, let's think of the word freedom. Now, this is an extremely abstract idea, but when we surround it with words like, for example, my freedom or individual freedom, it becomes an object that we can talk about, an object that's owned. And when you turn these things into objects, you can then analyze them. Yet the reality of the object named freedom is only felt to be real in everyday life when we experience it, or lack it, or use it. So how about a concept that's a little bit more real? So let's take the concept time. Now, the object named day, or a day, is based on the Earth's rotation, right? So one single rotation is 1 day. The rotation is a naturally occurring phenomenon that we imagine happens through time. But we decided to divide time into this particular measurable entity. So in that very moment, we have an object, a day, that has been divided and measured into a discrete entity. But even at the grammatical level, we say phrases like length of time, or a year, or even we say stuff like there was a time when. So suddenly there is an object that exists. We objectify time in a particular way. So this object exists. There was a time when blah, blah, blah. So this object exists somewhere in the past that we can now talk about and analyze. So we objectify things in all kinds of habitual ways. because we don't think about it much, or because it's actually built into our particular grammar. Now, something like a language, when we say a language, right, we objectify the abstract ideal of language. So we objectify this into a singular bound entity, a language. So we draw a circle around it, almost like freezing it in place. But we're constantly inventing language. So we're constantly, for example, adding new words. For example, like the word adulting, or a few years ago, EVOO, which was the acronym for extra virgin olive oil. We saw that get added to the dictionary. So we see these words, they get added to the dictionary. On the other hand, we might stop using words, or words might change meaning, like the word gay, which was at some point meaning happy, but now we perceive it as a sexual orientation. There are other words like cerveza, or mañana, or Los Angeles. Now, are these words in Spanish? Are they Spanish words in English? Now, we're constantly tricking ourselves into thinking that we can draw a circle around language, that we can trap it into this entity. Even if I say English was invented. English was invented. I just put that in past tense. So even there, you have an object that is already finished. It's done. It's complete. The project of English is invented, past tense, and now we can talk about it. So how do we get out of this? How do we talk about a language without freezing it in place? So how about we use the verb languaging? So we shift the emphasis from language, the abstract object, or the objectified concept, to something that is realized from one utterance to the next. This is no easy thing to accept. Garcia and Way are going against centuries worth of scholarship that say languages exist as discrete bound objects, as discrete entities with their own pure grammatical systems. There are linguists like Saussure or Chomsky who say that language is an object that we can study scientifically. We have countries and resistance groups fighting for language preservation, for example. Every part of our common sense tells us languages are worth fighting over. Notice what I did there too. I said languages in plural, meaning multiple objects have emerged just by adding S. So now we have many discrete languages. So the authors want to try to move beyond this idea of a language, or languages as discrete entities. Now, they want us to try to see our brains or our grammars as a giant unified repertoire of linguistic features. That's page 2. This is ultimately what translanguaging is built on. Elsewhere, they call this an idiolect, but for now, we're going to stick to this book's vocabulary. So we're just going to call it a linguistic repertoire. Now, looking at the figure on page 14, the very top part. So we have a traditional bilingualism model, right? So you have L1 and you have L2, language 1, language 2. Underneath, you have linguistic features, right? So these are separated. In this graph, you have two discrete objects. The implication being that humans exist as monolinguals or double monolinguals if they know more than one named language. Meaning they use one language and one part of the brain, and then they turn off the other language and the other part of the brain. We just spoke about how we accidentally objectify language all the time in our grammar. Even look at the word bilingual. The bi part, right? Meaning two. The implication being that there are at least two languages, two systems, two pure systems that exist as discrete objects in the same person. The same exact kind of objectification occurs with other words like multilingualism, meaning several languages, even monolingual, meaning only one language, or there's even terms like code switching, meaning that there are more than one discrete codes that we flip back and forth. Or even our cell phones that highlight misspelled words if the spelling doesn't match the particular language setting that you're in. So all of these language objects emerge all over the place, all the time. Okay, so let's look at the second part of this particular picture, the second Cummings model. So this brings the two languages closer, right? So they're kind of sort of interrelated, kind of sort of interdependent a little bit, but they're still separate. Now the idea here is we flip back and forth between each system, which may or may not consistently influence one another. But again, you have one language with unique features, all the F's that are underneath, and another language with unique features, so its own set of F's underneath. It again splits our brain's mental grammars in half. So we tell our kids, our students, we have two systems and we're trying to master one of them. It's okay to use the other one for help. Ultimately, the main goal that we want here is for you to behave and sound like a fluent monolingual in English, for example, in the United States. Or better yet, we want you to become a dual monolingual where one language is valuable and one language stays at home or used with your friends or whatever. Now, moving very quickly to the next page, page 15. There's a short discussion on Althusser's idea of interpolation. So I'm going to tell you the real quick version of what this means using his famous example. So a cop sees you in the street and says, "Hey you, stop." And you freeze and you turn around. In that moment, you are brought into being as a citizen who stops for a state authority. You're brought into being. Now, in the same way, I think what Garcia and Way are saying is that a bilingual, meaning the type of person that we call a bilingual with two discrete language systems, that idea or that kind of person is created by the education system itself. So they are brought into being as a bilingual. Meaning we're constantly telling our kids, this is how you think of yourself. This is how you are as a bilingual type of person. Your brain is split in half. That's your brain's grammars are split in half into discrete entities, into discrete pure systems. That is the way you exist. Now, we don't say that explicitly, obviously, but the implications are always there. Now, Garcia's and Way's translanguaging model, which is the bottom one, this model proposes that we teach our kids a new way of existing in the world, that they have a unified repertoire of linguistic features. It's very different from two pure systems. Yet the implications of this view of language, might be about 1,000 times more radical than you think. If you get rid of the separations between named languages, then we have to rethink some of our basic foundational stuff about our lives. Not to mention all the scholarship that is built on the assumption that there are such things, such objects as singular, pure language systems that exist in the first place. This translanguaging idea could change everything. So instead of splitting our kids' brains in half, we instead start telling them that we have a giant unified collection of languaging features with no split where we conventionally recognize named languages. Those splits aren't there anymore. So what will this do to kids? This is a new way of being and existing. What will this model do for teachers? What will it do to language learning policies? What will it do to teachers? Now, this is messing around with some very basic beliefs that we've had for a really long time. Now, but really, do you believe the first two models are accurate? That our brains' grammars are split in half? There really isn't any proof. In fact, there's evidence against that. What these first two models imply is that named languages, like English or Chinese or Japanese, because they are named and protected by nation states, so these named languages being wholly social constructs, somehow because we believe languages exist like this, we can then map on these constructs onto our biology, our brain matter that activates and deactivates when we change languages. Again, no proof that happens. In fact, doesn't that feel extremely and radically simplified? Isn't that a very simplified idea of how the brain works? Now, doesn't that sound like a pretty huge leap in logic? Now, one thing is probably true. It is possible to force and suppress a part of our linguistic repertoire. So we can forcibly mute certain features or certain collections of linguistic features that go by the name of English or Spanish or whatever. We can suppress these through violence in many forms, from tanks and missiles to, basically anything from guns to grade books, all forms of violence. So one major idea that Garcia is asking us to go beyond is to go beyond our common sense knowledge about language. That is no easy task. From being a person that speaks a language or two languages to conceptualizing ourselves as languagers that pull and recall from a giant repertoire of linguistic features. Now, how are we supposed to get this project done? The next chapter, she starts giving us hints, or they start giving us hints. So that's it for this video. I will see you for part 2.